Hey, everybody. Okay, so I want to go back and take another look at the nitrogen cycle and give you a little better overview of that than I was able to do it in class. Um, so let's dig into that, if you will. So you saw this graphic before, right? And I tried to clean this up a little bit, make it a little easier. Actually, this wasn't the graphic I was intending on using. That's part of where I got backtracked a little. But in any event, so hopefully I can make this a little clearer. Again, something you probably have looked at already in your freshman, sophomore level biology courses, but there are some differences between wetlands and uplands, and we'll cover those. Okay. I'm going to try and keep this quick. I don't want this to take more than 5 or 10 minutes at the most. So here we go. Um, there's a lot going on in the nitrogen cycle. In fact, it is the most complex of the biogeochemical cycles that we're looking at, right? It's more complex than the nitrogen, I'm sorry, more complex than the carbon cycle, more complex than the phosphorus cycle, more complex than the water cycle, if you look at that, right? So the objective here then is to try and unpack this. And I think the easiest way to unpack it is to simplify it into the goal, right? So, as we talked about, nitrogen is readily abundant in the environment. It's one of the most abundant nutrients in the environment. But most of it globally is in the atmosphere in a not easily bioavailable gas, right? In the form of two nitrogen atoms stuck together. It's a triple bond. It's a very strong bond, and it's not easily broken, right? It's not easily pulled apart. So this nitrogen, which makes up nearly 80% of the atmosphere, so 78% of the atmosphere, is it's not really usable to us. You and I, we breathe it in, we breathe it out. Every breath I'm taking, nearly 80% of what I'm breathing in is nitrogen gas that I'm just going to exhale again here in half a second. And this is true for most living organisms. There are really only a small number of organisms that can actually deal with that nitrogen, right, in that form and convert it into something that has some utility. So the objective here, if you'll follow my laser pointer, is to get this nitrogen that usually gets into the soils in one of two ways, right? That either filters into the soils as a gas, right? So that interface between the soils and the atmosphere, you get some penetration of that gas into the soils. Another common way that it gets into the soils is via fertilizers. Okay. Those fertilizers can be natural fertilizers like manures, or they can be manufactured fertilizers, but those can add nitrogen to the soil as well. So the objective is for living organisms is for this nitrogen that I've circled here with this dotted line is to get it to a process where it is mineralized. And this mineralization process is where that nitrogen is converted into ammonium, right? So this is NH4. Then from there, the next trick is to get ammonium converted into nitrite and then over into nitrate. Okay. This process, all right, is this is a process of bacteria, and there are quite a lot of bacteria and microbes that do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Um, it's nitrate, okay, that is the most bioavailable. This has the most utility for plants to be able to pull up through their roots and use in their biologic processes. Um, Now, nitrite is just really an intermediate step between ammonium and nitrate. Okay, and actually, nitrite doesn't stick around a whole lot. It's not something that's going to persist in the soils for a very long period of time, and that's actually a good thing because nitrite is toxic to plant roots and some organisms. So we really don't want that in there for a long period of time. All right, so this is the objective, is to get from here to here, to here, to here. Okay, that's what we want, is just kind of this loop. But you can see there's a lot of other things happening in this graph. Um, so what are the hiccups here? Well, the hiccups is there's a lot of places, a lot of ways that this nitrogen can be lost in this system and not become available to plants, right? So, um, one of the ways this happens is the nitrogen gets into the soils, it goes through mineralization, and then it gets converted to ammonium, but then that ammonium gets picked up by microbes in the soils, and it becomes actually part of their tissues, right? And from that point, it's no longer accessible to them. It's not something that they actually can utilize. All right, so that's that's problematic. Another thing that can happen, right, is that when the nitrogen gets down into the soils, it if it goes through mineralization, then it gets converted into ammonium and then goes through this nitrification process. So that nitrification process is carried out by what are referred to as nitrifying bacteria, right? And so this would include things like nitrobacter is one of those. Nitrospira is another one fairly common. I see that in wetland environments and some of my own work. Um, so if it goes through this process and gets converted into nitrate, nitrate is highly soluble. And so in soils that are well drained, that nitrate can leach out of those soils very rapidly. So last class period, we talked about soil particles and soil particle size, interstitial spaces, all that sort of stuff, high permeability versus low permeability soils. Well, in high permeability soils, it's pretty easy for nitrate to get leached out and actually leach out down into the groundwater or into deep subsoils where it is no longer available to the plants that are up in those higher O and A horizons, right? So that's problematic. Another problem is that there's a whole nother class of bacteria. These are denitrifying bacteria. So there are some Micrococcus species, there are Thiobacillus species, Serratia, Pseudomonas, among others, that all of them can take this nitrate and they can then convert it back into the atmosphere either as, again, nitrogen gas, or in some cases, they can convert it into nitrous oxides. Okay. And nitrogens, interesting thing, I won't get off too much on a side note here, but we talk a lot about climate change when we're talking, we talk a lot about carbon in climate change, right? As a climate gas. Oxides of nitrogen also are powerful global warming gases, greenhouse gases. So there's some hazard associated with these oxides of nitrogen when they get up into the atmosphere that elemental nitrogen here does not have. Okay, so these are two loss points. Immobilization is a loss point, and then ammonium itself can volatilize as ammonia gas, right, NH3, out into the atmosphere and be lost that way. So we talked about sources and sinks for things. Soils are good sinks, and wetland soils in particular, as we're going to see here in a second, are good sinks for nitrogen, but they also are leaky. And so there's a lot of opportunities for nitrogen to be diverted into categories that they're not bioavailable for plants. And so, and in fact, can in some sources be a source of nitrogen back to the atmosphere, right? Or into water sources. And in water sources, they have their own problematic issues, and we won't get into that in this particular instance. Now, as I mentioned earlier in class, the ammonium, when it's immobilized in these bacteria, becomes part of their tissue. When they die, that nitrogen can then go back through this process of mineralization and then be converted back to ammonium, where it could potentially then be picked up by nitrifying bacteria and go through that process, or it might be picked up by other bacteria, become part of their tissues, and then immobilized. So, there's a lot of different, or it could volatilize, right? So, all of these options are always options. Okay. All right. So this is the basics of it. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a couple of resources if you want to read more about this and get more into it if you've not had this background. Like I say, it's very complicated, and I don't get into the depths of the nitrogen cycle very often in my particular work. This is a little further into the weeds than I typically go. So you may or may not use this on a regular basis either, but if you want to know more, I'll have more in it. So I'm showing in this graphic an upland, right? Well, let's see here. Get this. All right, here we go. So this is the graphic I wanted to show you, which is this is the nitrogen cycle in a wetland environment, right? And so the primary difference in a wetland environment, so you can see a lot of the same steps are here. It's really the same process. It's even a lot of the same bacteria that are involved, right? Um, the process is very similar, but the nature of the environment, particularly the level of oxygen that's present, and as I attempted to allude to in class, the presence of oxygen that's present is really critical to how quickly those processes happen and whether those soils really become a significant sink that hold that nitrogen for long periods of time, or whether it cycles through pretty quickly. Okay. So when we look at upland environments, so above the water line, right? Um, those soils are pretty aerobic. Okay. This is true of even the soils below the surface that you would actually see or put your foot on top of that are above the water table, right? So depending on where you are, that can actually be fairly deep. Here in our area, and especially in Galveston, you don't have to dig very far to hit the water table. But above that water table, those soils are fairly well aerated. There's plant roots, there's organisms digging around in it. There's more organic material that tends not to be as compacted, so there's more opportunity for gases to diffuse down into those soils. Um, so we would refer to these as oxid conditions. And this leads to more organic nitrogen mineralization. Now, something I forgot to tell you earlier is that when we talk about organic nitrogen, that's largely in the form of amines, okay? And it's a whole family of chemicals. So it's not just one thing, it's a whole family of things. That's why you see it categorized as organic nitrogen. So amines have hydrogens associated with them, and that's why they're fairly easily converted into ammonium, for instance. So in any event, so you've got large amounts of organic nitrogen, and this in turn leads to pretty ready nitrification processes. So those bacteria that we talked about can convert that into nitrite and then quickly on into nitrate. And that's all good. But so that's the form that the plants are going to uptake, are those nitrates. All right. However, nitrate is also very easily leached from the soils into groundwater. And also, it can undergo heterotrophic decomposition. So, organisms that are consuming that and breaking it down, right? Before it becomes useful for plant communities. So, it's again a very different environment compared to wetlands, where number one, the soils are in fact the largest pool of nitrogen in wetlands. So you find a lot of nitrogen in the soils as opposed to in the plant community above the soils, right? Or in the water table, right? So most of the nitrogen in wetland soils is in its organic form, again, these amines. and it's conserved in the microbes through that immobilization process to a great extent. So there's a lot of immobilization that occurs in these wetland environments. And part of that has to do with the fact that nitrification and denitrification are typically occurring at lower levels than you would see in well aerated soils because they tend to be flood stressed and they tend to be anoxic or anaerobic, right? And so those processes are slowed down because there are fewer bacteria that are actually able to do that, number one. It's not a very good environment for those aerobic bacteria to live in. And a lot of that actually occurs right at the interface at the surface where the water and the air are meeting each other, which in frequently inundated environments, the longer it's inundated, the harder it's going to be for those bacteria in the soils to get up where the air is, right? Or to get the air because they're underwater. So you tend to see more nitrification occurring in like intertidal wetlands than you're going to find, out off of those intertidal wetlands where those seagrasses are. You're not going to find as much nitrification in those particular environments because they're deeper. There's more water, more flooding stress. Um, and those conditions, those anoxic conditions, don't lend themselves to having the oxygen that's necessary to create the nitrate, right? So it's much more of that is diverted to immobilization. Um, and so what NO3, what nitrate is actually produced is usually taken up pretty quickly by the plants that are in those areas, right? So think about Spartina alterniflora. Oh, it just occurs to me, I'm wearing my wetland mitigation bank shirt. Anyway, look at me being dressed appropriately. So the nitrate is pretty quickly picked up and utilized because there's not a whole lot of it, not nearly as much as you find in those drier environments where there's more oxygen in order to work with, right? So again, we do see these processes, and there's a lot of commonalities there, but it's slowed down, and that means that nitrogen, that immobilized nitrogen, is it tends to stay in the water for a longer period of time, and even when it does something like volatilize, it tends to then get into the water as opposed to back up in the atmosphere, and that can then be consumed by organisms. They get back into the sediments. So nitrogen in wetland environments that gets into the soils and the sediments tend to stay in those soils and sediments for much longer periods of time than they do in drier environments. This is from some of my most recent research. So I have a good friend of mine's a microbiologist working on this project, and she's been working with some of the students categorizing different types of bacteria that are in these sediments associated with these different types of shoreline. So we're looking at um, uh, restored wetlands, some natural wetlands, and also some armored shorelines. And one of the bacteria that we find fairly commonly in these environments is nitrous spiraea, right? And so you can see it in purple, and you can see it here, and we find it at nearly all of our sites. Now, we tend to find it in slightly higher proportions where the conditions are better. So that tends to be in shallower environments, more associated with wetland plants than we'll find in deeper environments where there's more water. So bulkheaded sites where the water is fairly deep, you don't tend to find as much of it by proportion. So again, this is the bacteria, though, that you would see in a variety of wetland environments, and you'll see it in some terrestrial environments as well. So with that, that's the short story there. I'm sorry I didn't get that across very well in class, so I definitely wanted to do a better job of that. And got off track right at the first slide and couldn't get it back on track. So hopefully this helps and this is better. I think the other ones, phosphorus and carbon are fairly straightforward and should be a lot easier to work through. However, if you want to go into more depth in regard to the nitrogen cycle, there are some pretty good resources out here. This is an interactive model that I think is pretty cool. This is a really good paper that talks a lot about the differences between upland and wetland environments in terms of how they manage nitrogen. And this as well is a good resource. So you can take a look at these if you like. And with that, hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.